My name's Gary Bartis, born and raised right here in Manchester, New Hampshire. I grew up in a housing project, so there were two choices, be a criminal or be a cop. And I just wanted to be a police officer.
And the last service rank one is for Gary Bartis.
And I was a police officer in the state for 44 years. I was a detective sergeant with the Auburn Police Department.
Auburn is a lot of open fields, beautiful, like suburban homes. You think when you're going somewhere like Auburn that you're in a safe, family-oriented, pretty quiet location.
People would always ask me, well, what do you do as a cop in Auburn? I said, I do the same thing as a New York City officer does, just a lot less of it. That morning, I was actually in the station. We received a 911 call that there was a dead body.
There are always murders on Christmas. I always had a homicide, either Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. Everybody's home, everybody's drunk, and somebody is unhappy with yet another tie.
When I first got to the scene, I was very familiar with the property. It's like an old cottage going back to like the 40s. It's on a big piece of land.
The officers who first discovered the body have confirmed, in fact, that the victim is the homeowner, 50-year-old George Jodwin.
George Jodwin was well known in the area. Never had any real serious calls to service at that residence.
Bartis goes as directed by the patrol officers on the scene to the upstairs master bedroom.
First thing we see is George is in bed. For lack of a better terminology, it looked like his brain was on the pillow.
They see a person with gaping gunshot wounds to the head. Large caliber gunshot wounds to the head are really ugly. It's like dropping a grenade in somebody's ear canal. It's incredible the amount of damage it does.
There was blood splattered on the headboard of the bed and as well as the wall.
They look more closely at the gunshot wounds, 2 in the head and 1 in the neck.
There were no shell casings in the bedroom, which indicated to us that it was a revolver.
George was tucked under the covers. He didn't change into any pajamas or anything like that. There was no signs of any struggle.
He's in a relaxed position, probably passed out from alcohol. You can always smell alcohol in someone's breath if you're close to them, but you can also smell it in their blood. He appeared to just be asleep when he is executed by somebody with a large caliber handgun, and probably never felt it. Bartis can't think of a single reason why someone would want to fill his head with bullets, yet here he is.
What I knew about George is that he had a personality, a big personality. He owned a pawn shop on the west side of Manchester.
He was active in the community. He did run for the city office. He had his pilot's license. He played the piano. He owned a yacht, and he would go sailing to different countries.
He's a confirmed bachelor. He is very successful in business. He paints a picture of a very interesting man, a Renaissance man, perhaps.
The Jodwin family was very well known. You just don't expect a family like that to be victimized.
You don't really realize that these things could happen in your town until they do. And it is a shock and a wake-up call that these things can happen to anybody, anywhere.
Nothing in the room was really disruptive except for some dresser drawers that were open. And so I thought that was kind of like odd. What would be the reason for that?
There's no real fast, crazy tossing that happens in burglaries. Is this just a mess? Or was someone looking for something in George's dresser?
The house didn't have any signs of forced entry. As a matter of fact, the door going into the kitchen was wide open, unlocked. There was no pry marks, nothing indicating a burglary. To me, as an investigator, that indicates that the person that committed the crime knew him. The kitchen was a pile of dishes in the sink. There's some empty alcohol bottles.
It's the holidays. Perhaps a party was underway on the 26th, and this is the result, the aftermath of a party. The obvious question is, who is at this party? it would be likely to consider that one of them is responsible for this death. They do an area canvass. Most of the neighbors report that there were multiple gunshots in the afternoon, but explain that that's not unusual. Mr. Jodoin often does target practice on his own property. The only thing that bothered them was they heard 3 distinctive gunshots late at night, which is something that's never happened before.
The neighbor that lives directly across the street, he had heard the gunshots, looked at his digital clock that was on his bedstand and it said 10:48. So we knew the time frame of the actual murder.
When something bad happens, something this big, things spread like wildfire. All of a sudden, everybody knows what's going on.
George Jodoin's brother arrives, Peter Jodoin, and wants to do everything he can to aid the police. It's fortunate that Peter arrived when he did because he was present at the party the house appears to have had the night of the victim's death.
Peter was telling us that that particular day, on the 26th, he had found George's .44 Magnum in a piano that George had given him, and he brought it back knowing it was George's weapon.
They asked Peter who was in attendance at this affair, and he says,
one of George's friends, Ricky Karen, was there.
Ricky Karen had used George's land to go hunting for birds, and then Arthur Collins had showed up.
Arthur Collins was kind of a handyman, junk man, do anything for you for a buck kind of guy. Was there towing a vehicle off the property.
So there were 3 people with totally different reasons for being there. So they decided to take the gun Peter brought in target practice.
They were having a few drinks and they were target practicing with a .44 Magnum.
It's a .44 Magnum revolver, so no ejected casings. .44 Magnum is one of the largest calibers available in a handgun, so it would produce massive gunshot wounds, the same type that George Jodoin suffered from. So Bartis reasonably concludes that that's the murder weapon, and whoever used it took it with him.
We were told that Arthur left earlier.
And then eventually Peter had to leave because his daughter had a high school basketball game.
So when he left, the only people present were George Jodoin, the victim, and Ricky Karen. They asked Peter, well, Ricky, does he get along well with George? Well, yes and no.
They would have some squabbles about foolish things sometimes, but that's just the way their relationship was.
So now we have 2 guys in a room separated by a .44 Magnum and a bunch of alcohol, and they have a history of arguments. So Ricky Karen is obviously the momentary focus.
Just as Peter was telling us that Ricky was one of the last ones to see George alive, Ricky arrived at the scene.
How convenient, Mr. Karen.
He was nervous, he was upset, questioning what was going on. Why is he there? It was just, to me, very suspicious.
At that moment, Bartis looks at Ricky Karen's pants, and they're covered in dark red specks.
The assumption was they were bloodstains.
There is a cloud of blood that emanates from a gunshot wound. The blood moves toward the killer. The killer is going to have high-velocity blood spatter on his clothing. It seems that Mr. Karen has a little explaining to do. Ricky Karen has shown up at the scene with what looks like high-velocity blood spatter on his pants. Karen says, I don't know what you think that is, but what it is ink. I'm a screen printer. You never take a suspect at his word, but you do take what you think might be evidence from his person, and in this case, it's his pants.
We brought him down to the police station, gave him a pair of sweatpants, so the genes could be tested to find out if that was actually blood or some other substance.
So, as it turned out, after the pants were examined by forensics, the dots, they're not human blood, they are ink, as Karen said they were.
But we still wondered if he had anything to do with this because he was the last one to see George alive. Ricky was concerned, nervous. He says he was on his way to have breakfast and saw the police activity and decided to stop and see what was going on. To me, it's not a coincidence that he's showing up.
They questioned Ricky Karen about the prior day. What happened after everyone left but you?
We had a little more small talk, George and I, talking about how he had some land for sale somewhere up north.
You left George's house. Do you know what time it was roughly?
Well, I know when I left, it was dusk. I had to go pick up my girlfriend then. And that was the last time I saw my friend.
Ricky talked about going to the Aloha restaurant in Manchester. And I personally talked to a bartender, and she verified that he had been there.
Ricky Karen did not kill his friend. He had no opportunity to kill his friend. So they asked Ricky Karen, did George say what he was going to do for the rest of the evening? Well, he did say Arthur was going to come by later, George's handyman.
You always look at who's the last person to see him alive. We ended up reaching out to Arthur and told him that, we need to speak with him.
Arthur Collins was interviewed by me and by Jim White of the state police.
Arthur, could you just tell us a little bit about your relationship with George?
Yes. I met him at the pawn shop. He's my friend. We drink buddies too,
Arthur Collins does have a long association with the victim. He does odd jobs for him.
Wednesday afternoon, what was your contact with George?
He said, come over and get a couple of junk cars I had. So I did. I had to fix the tire for him. So I made another trip and dropped the tire off.
Arthur says, I got there at 7 o'clock. We had a couple of beers.
I had some books and then I went home.
What time did you get home on Wednesday evening?
I'd say 9:30.
We know from the neighbors that the shots were heard, the fatal shots, at 10:48 p.m. Mr. Collins has a solid alibi.
We felt suspicious about Arthur Collins because the way he interviewed, he was nervous. But after checking the alibi and finding out that what he said was verified by his wife, he dropped off the suspect list.
So who came by after Arthur Collins left and wound up killing our victim? In every murder case, it's always interesting to speak to who found the body. Did you know to find it because you created it? George's body was initially discovered by his business partner, Glenn Baruti. They'd been partners for several years in the pawn shop. I buy and sell everything. Everyone in town describes him as George's best friend.
We had gone into the pawn shop. We spoke with Glenn.
I was supposed to meet him at his house. He was planning on taking a trip to Kylie at the end of the month. And he's got animals that have to be taken care of out there.
So that's supposedly why Glenn went over there, to be taught how to take care of the animals while George was out of the country.
I pulled in a little after 9. I saw his front door was open. I walked in the house figuring, he was in the shower or something.
Describe to me what you saw when you looked into his bedroom.
It looked like he was asleep in his bed, and I said, hey, get up, your animals are hungry. He didn't move. And then when I walked over the bed, I saw it looked like his brain or something coming out here. And I ran out of there.
Now, Bartis expects to hear the next thing is that he called 911. He didn't do that. Baruti says something off the wall.
I didn't know what to do. I went to my father. I said, you gotta call the police, I can't do it.
You didn't speak with the police? No.
The fact that he rushed out of there to his father's house without calling the police, it's very odd.
And one thing you don't like when you're a homicide detective is something being odd.
What time you closed the business last night?
Yeah, 7 o'clock.
And then what did you do?
I went right home and left over turkey and ham and stuff. I read like magazine in bed and shut my light. And that was it.
Okay, what time about did you think that was?
It had to be a little after 9.
Glenn Baruti does not have a verifiable alibi of any kind. So investigators try a different angle. Bartis asks Glenn if he can take a look at the pawn shop's records.
Glenn was very, very forthcoming. He let us into his office.
So they're going through paperwork, and inadvertently and innocently, they come across a recent last will and testament of George Jodewin. Ooh, look at this.
George had changed the will and put everything in Glenn's name.
So he was going to be the heir of everything. He had the business, the house, the boat. So Glenn had the most to gain. And I felt he's the man that committed the homicide.
They have encountered no one else with a motive like this, and it is one hell of a motive. New Hampshire detectives are looking into the violent death of George Jodewin, and the natural emerging suspect is Glenn Baruti, his business partner and heir to George Jodewin's fortune.
We did a polygraph. The polygraph came out inconclusive. We also did a surveillance. We followed him all night, and it was uneventful. We didn't develop anything outside of our, the old police gut feeling. We really had nothing on him.
He has suspicions, yes, but there's no such crime as suspicion.
During the whole investigation of George's homicide, we interviewed many people, friends, business associates, and none of it ever developed anything serious to give us a solid suspect. We ran out of leads, and the case went ice cold.
Are you frustrated at this point?
I don't get mad. It's not my personality. I did my job, did the best we could. In law enforcement, we know that somewhere along the line, even if a case goes cold, somebody's going to talk.
So we're driving on the bridge into the west side. Several times I've heard other people yelling out to say, hey, Bobby, yeah, come get your coffee and all this stuff. People know you're around town.
Well, when you're born here, a lot of people know you. And when you work here, especially as a policeman, it makes it easier for people to trust you because they know you. My name is Robert Freitas. I'm born and raised in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm retired from the Manchester Police Department. I think any cop that you talk to who's retired will tell you the same thing. It's the greatest job in the world. So in 2011, I became involved in this case as a member of the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. Members of the Jodewin family had contacted the Cold Case Unit about bringing George's case to the forefront of our investigations. They were very proactive with trying to get information to solve it.
This was a whodunit. The vast majority of homicides in New Hampshire aren't whodunits. There was a lot of talk about this homicide for a long time.
It has a larger impact than you can imagine because it makes us as a community feel safer to have an ending to a case like this.
The whole idea of attacking an inactive murder case is to begin on page 1. Review this case as if it just happened. Take a cold look at this with a new set of eyes.
Bill Barry with the Auburn, New Hampshire Police Department. He was working with me on this case.
Once I get involved with a case, I dig like a pit bull. I was like, I'm not going to let go.
I'd known him for a long time. We think alike. And we kind of gelled together. We came up with a plan to reinvestigate. Reviewing the case, we knew that Ricky Caron, Arthur Collins, and Peter Jodewin were there that night. And Glenn Baruti was the one that found George in his bed on that morning of the 27th of December. But was it possible that somebody else could have been involved? We thought potentially, was it maybe a jilted lover, somebody that George may have been involved with at some point?
George Jodewin had a reputation as being a ladies' man. Jealousy is always a powerful emotion. What if he's dating someone and then she discovers that there are other women in his life? Well, hell hath no fury, as they say. So he starts there. Friedis, over time, he meets with many women who have enjoyed George's company. But they all say one thing: he's a gentleman. Not a heartbreaker, but they discover some interesting gossip. There was a rumor that George Jodewin was bisexual.
Through the investigation, there were a lot of weird stories that came out about George.
But no one wants to confirm anything. So they developed no suspects from any of that conversation. Friedis is being thorough. So he continues looking into past relationships, and they come across a woman named Tammy Floyd. And she just so happens to be the sister-in-law of George's handyman, Arthur Collins, typical of a small town.
We went to Tammy's address in Manchester, New Hampshire, to speak with her about a potential relationship that she had with George Jobin. And her daughter, Belinda Floyd, was also there.
While we were talking to Tammy, I had asked her if she had a relationship with George.
Tammy Floyd denied any relationship whatsoever with George Jobin.
So we kind of ruled that out.
At that point, we asked them about any recollection they had of the night of George's homicide.
One thing that Tammy did finally say was, well, my daughter was actually at Arthur's house the night of the murder.
Her daughter, Belinda Floyd, told us she had been at Arthur's home that night playing cards with Arthur's wife.
Friedis thinks this could be a real opening. No one knew Belinda existed.
Belinda was only 16 at the time. She was in school, so she was staying with them over school vacation. One of the questions that I asked Belinda was, what time did Arthur get home the night, December 26th?
Looking back at Arthur's statements to the original detectives, he said it was 9:30 when he got home. Belinda says none of that is true.
She remembered specifically that Arthur came in sometime after midnight that night. He appeared to have been drinking, and he went right to his bed. And there was no other talk with him.
We know the murder took place around 10:48 p.m. I was a key at that point.
That changed everything. It was possible that it was, in fact, Arthur Collins that murdered George Jobin.
So Friedis goes back and re-interviews the wife of Arthur Collins and says, how certain are you as to what time he came home? She said, I thought it might be 9:30, but it could have been midnight. So they have shot his alibi full of holes. Did they do it with a .44 Magnum? Well, we're about to see.
Arthur Collins was the type of guy that would live paycheck to paycheck some weeks and no paycheck to no paycheck other weeks, and would often pawn property at George's shop in Manchester because he needed money.
It was like Groundhog Day with Arthur Collins, because he would show up, pawn off his tools, get some money, end of the month, come back, retrieve his tools, and then the same thing over and over again. But George was so nice to him that he would give, Arthur extra time to come and retrieve his tools, and he wouldn't even attempt to sell them.
In February of 2012, Bill Barry and I picked up Arthur at his home in Manchester.
The true advantage of a cold case investigator, the element of surprise. 10 years later, when a new policeman knocks on the door, Arthur Collins is hopelessly unprepared. So he's at his weakest point, the perfect time to talk to him.
And we kind of confronted him with the information that we had.
Arthur now says, well, I really don't remember what time I got home. We got pretty drunk.
We knew that he was not being truthful with us. We weren't going to let him off the hook.
So Friedis continues to apply the pressure. How much can I make you believe that you're going to be tortured for the rest of your days on this planet unless you start telling me the truth? Pressure works.
It was at that time that Arthur told us that he was present during the time of George's homicide, but it wasn't him that did it.
He knows who killed George. He's been shielding him for 10 long years. Now we're getting somewhere. At this point in this investigation, Friedis now knows that Arthur Collins, by his own admission, was present when George Jodewin was shot to death.
He just came right out and says, yeah, I was there, but I didn't do it.
Arthur said it was, in fact, James LaRoche that was the one that murdered George Chauvin.
They never heard of this name. James LaRoche is cousins with Arthur's wife.
Arthur told us that he had gone back to George's property with Jimmy LaRoche, and the three of them at the property drank. It got to the point where Arthur didn't want to stay anymore. Arthur went out to his vehicle. He started his vehicle up, warmed his vehicle because it was December at the time, so it was cold.
All of a sudden, Arthur heard 3 distinct loud gunshots, and he saw muzzle flashes in the upstairs bedroom window.
And then Jim LaRoche came running out.
Got into his truck and said, I hurt George bad. We need to get out of here. So Arthur then drove James LaRoche back to Manchester, where he dropped them off at his residence on the west side. Arthur did admit at that point that he lied about his timeline account because he was afraid of what James LaRoche may do to him.
The cat is out of the bag, Arthur, and we're under no obligation to ignore it. James LaRoche now becomes suspect number 1. So Freitas rounds up James LaRoche and brings him in.
I had kind of asked Jimmy LaRoche, what does he remember about George's homicide? And he says immediately, I know nothing, very abruptly, very fast.
He said, not only didn't I not do this, I wasn't even there because I was in Florida at the time.
So at that point, we said that he was done talking with us and didn't want to be bothered anymore. So we did some research, and from some Manchester police reports that we were able to dig up, we knew that James LaRoche was not in Florida at the time of George's homicide, that he was in fact in Manchester.
So he's trying to provide an alibi, and instead he provides a lie. It's never good to lie to the police, because they're going to make you eat it. So Freitas thinks, all right, Arthur, you say this is what happened, so we're going to set you up with a recorded telephone, and you're going to talk to James LaRoche and bring up this murder and see what happens.
Arthur was very cooperative and appreciative of the fact that we were trying to eliminate him as a suspect.
The cops have been trying to talk to me every day, and I'm getting sick of it.
Hey, don't feel bad. My phone goes off all day long, too, so...
Did you tell anybody about that, or?
Tell anybody about what? What night? What night are you talking about?
The night we were out there.
I wasn't out there with you.
Jim LaRoche had, was kind of dodging the questions. You could tell he was thrown off guard.
So why did you have to shoot him then?
Who?
You.
I didn't shoot him. Crazy.
James LaRoche denied any involvement in the homicide, told Arthur, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. This is crazy.
I don't know nothing, Arthur. Because I didn't do anything, so I don't know nothing.
James LaRoche doesn't say anything about the murder. He doesn't say anything about anything.
At that point, Bill and I met with James LaRoche and convinced him to take a polygraph examination concerning his involvement in the Chauvin homicide. And that test was administered by Sergeant Scott Gilbert. Scott was a member of the cold case unit with me.
James LaRoche was convincing that he was sitting for this because he didn't do it. And I assured him that if he didn't have any involvement in this, that he was going to pass this polygraph exam and detectives can move on. He answered all my questions without hesitation. And we discussed whether he was responsible for this, and he showed no deception.
Scotty came out and said he passed with flying colors. He didn't do it.
Investigators asked LaRoche why did he lie about being in Florida at the time of George's murder.
And he said, well, I was drinking heavily and I black out a lot.
He made a comment to us that most of 2001 was a blank to him.
That's a reasonable statement. So all this time, Arthur Collins has been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself and onto his wife's cousin, James LaRoche.
He was blaming someone else that actually wasn't even there.
He thinks this plan is going to work, which wouldn't make any sense to a 6-year-old, but Arthur isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. Thank you so much for being an idiot. We're now in a position to shove this down your throat.
So wanted to speak with Arthur and get him to take a polygraph. And he agreed to take it. On the day that we were supposed to do it, and we went to pick him up, he was not home. Arthur ghosts us. For about 3 weeks, he won't answer phone calls. We go to his home. He won't answer the door. He was making himself scarce.
Arthur is in the wind. He doesn't want to talk about this polygraph because he knows what that could mean. And so does Freitas. So he devises a better plan.
We sat here, we made a call to him, telling him that we were going to come by his house around 11 to speak with him.
He sets up a tactical team around Arthur's house, so there is no escape by car from his home. Trap is set, let's see if it springs.
Waited, and we saw him emerge from his building to get into his vehicle. He was beating feet to get out of the area before we got there. And as he passed here, the TAC team got behind him down here and made a stop. The officers that approached him in the car had full tactical gear. I think it had a psychological effect on him. I think in his mind, he's thinking that, am I getting arrested for a homicide?
It's easy to mess with someone's head when it's filled with fear. Arthur is a ball of yarn. Freitas is the captain.
A short time later, Bobby and I pulled up behind him. We said, what's going on, Arthur?
And I explained to him, if you take the polygraph examination and you pass it, we won't bother you again. So he agreed to do that.
Well, I appreciate you coming in here today so we can get this resolved.
Yeah.
So now here is Arthur in the hot seat. We hook him up to a box and start asking him questions about the murder of George Jodewin.
He was very quiet. He didn't really speak unless spoken to, but he was adamant that he wasn't involved in it. Just be truthful.
Yeah.
All right? Ready?
Yeah.
Did you shoot that man?
No.
I could immediately see that this is not going to be good for him. Relax.
Arthur Collins failed the polygraph examination.
The only question he doesn't fail is your name Arthur Collins?
I set him back down, and I told him, Jim LaRoche did not shoot George Jodewin.
No?
No.
Like that.
Well, I'm hoping you're gonna tell me, because now I know for a fact that you've lied to me.
I did?
And yeah, you lied to me.
He's telling Arthur Collins chapter and verse the lies he's telling, causing Arthur to wind up like a $2 watch.
Please don't keep it to yourself. It's the last thing you want to do.
You know.
He didn't get up and run out or say I want a lawyer. I knew that there was more for him to say. And then I bring the detectives in and they have further conversation with him.
Arthur then admitted that he's the one that pulled the trigger, that he's the one that killed George. He didn't seem emotional. It was just matter of fact.
Arthur said that he arrived at George's home that evening after fixing the tire, that the two had engaged in some drinking. Arthur claimed that George had attempted to sexually assault him at the table, and then George grabbed him and took him into the bedroom.
Okay, all right, so what happens next?
He's just trying to do stuff to me, grabbing me and stuff.
Arthur says that George unbuckles his pants and, quote, tried to put his thing in my mouth. Well, okay,
How do you get away from George?
I just took off and went right out there and couldn't believe somebody was trying to do that to me.
According to him, he was extremely angry, enraged. He took the gun, went back into the bedroom.
Did George say anything to you?
No. I just pointed at him and the thing went off. Went off like a hair trigger. It was really fast and then I ran out of here.
So it has a hair trigger and it just went off. And then it went off again. And then it went off again. So the gun decided to fire 3 times because you contacted it mentally? Nothing even makes any sense. He's become a babbling idiot. So there is Arthur's story. The detectives are grateful to have it because a confession is a confession.
I don't believe his account that George Jodwin sexually assaulted him is true. I don't believe that at all.
It is clear at the moment this occurs, Jodwin is so drunk he falls face down in the bed and goes to sleep. You want us to believe that he was going to sexually assault you and tried to? I don't think so. Further conversations with Glenn Baruti, his business partner, reveal a different set of facts.
Earlier in the day, on December 26th of 2001, George had called Glenn to get some advice on Arthur's request to pawn his tow truck for money.
He was specifically looking for approximately $3,000.
The issue with the pawn of the truck was that Arthur wanted to keep the truck and wanted the money. And Glenn didn't think that was a good idea.
Although it can't be proven, the likely scenario is that George Jodwin probably told him, "You're a nice kid, Arthur, but we can't justify the loan, and I'm going to have to say no."
It's possible that Arthur may have left the residence. George had gotten into bed to go to sleep for the night.
Arthur sits in his truck and he stews. He's on the point of boil. And Arthur becomes furious because he really needs that money. Arthur walks right back in, picks up the gun, and goes upstairs. George is laying face down in the bed. And boom, boom, boom.
My thought is, after he did that, Arthur was going through the dresser drawers looking for money.
I believe that it was pure and simple. It was money. He was a desperate guy who needed cash.
Despite Arthur's confession, the .44 Magnum is never recovered.
He disposed of that weapon and holster in the salvage yard in Manchester. It was crushed and possibly transported overseas for recycling. After Arthur's polygraph examination, his confession, we took him into custody.
When they made the arrest of Arthur Collins, against my personality, I got angry because I said, damn, we missed it. But I think the people in Auburn will believe that now it's come to a close.
So Arthur Collins, in July of 2015, pled to second-degree murder, and he received a sentence of 30 years to life.
One of the sad parts about this is the fact that George treated him really well, and there was no reason for Arthur to do what he did to him.
Murder has no statute of limitations, and there's always somebody looking for the person that's responsible for it. And that should give some family members of unsolved homicides some solace of knowing that their loved one hasn't been forgotten.
George Jodwin forgot something about human nature. Humans don't change. Some people cannot be helped. But they're the same they've always been. Self-centered and dangerous. Period. The end. Believe otherwise, and you do so at your own risk. On the next American Detective.
We now have the identity of all 5 victims.
They have a spree killer on their hands. Once he begins, he will not stop.
Why is he doing this? Who is he targeting?
The fear was he would strike again.
Deep in the heart of Bavaria, where dense forests meet endless fields, lies a story that seems torn from the darkest corners of the human psyche. It is a story soaked in silence, wrapped in whispers of superstition, and carved into the frozen soil of a lonely farmstead. The place was called Hinterkaifeck, a modest, isolated homestead hidden behind thick woods, far from curious eyes. And it was there, in the spring of 1922, that one of the most chilling and unresolved crimes in German history unfolded. A crime that would haunt investigators for generations, a tale that blurred the line between the rational and the inexplicable. The land itself seemed to conspire in mystery. The Hinterkaifeck farm was cut off from the nearest village by more than a kilometer of forest path. The dirt track that led to it wound between trees that groaned in the wind, as if warning strangers to turn back. The farm belonged to Andreas Gruber, a stern, gray-haired patriarch whose reputation in the village was one of coldness and suspicion. Beside him lived his wife, Cecilia, hardened by decades of labor. Their daughter, Victoria, widowed after the Great War, lived on the farm with her 2 children, little Joseph, barely 2 years old, and her teenage daughter, also named Cecilia, just 7. Together, they made up a family marked by shadows, secrets, and the relentless silence of the countryside. The isolation was more than geographical. It was social, spiritual, almost cursed. Villagers spoke of the Grubers in half-whispers. There were rumors of unnatural relationships, of hidden shame, of things respectable people chose not to speak of aloud. The war had left scars on everyone, but Hinterkaifeck seemed burdened with something darker, heavier, as though its very soil drank sorrow. And then in late March of 1922, strange things began to happen. Events so unsettling that, when recalled later, they seemed to foreshadow doom with uncanny precision. Andreas Gruber, usually a man who scoffed at superstition, confided to neighbors that he had discovered footprints in the snow. They led from the forest straight to his farm, but not away from it. Whoever had approached the homestead that day had not left. Gruber searched every corner of the property, but found no intruder, no explanation, only the eerie, undeniable truth of those tracks disappearing into his yard. Other incidents followed. In the farmhouse attic, the family began to hear footsteps, slow, deliberate pacing above their heads at night. Andreas climbed the ladder with a lantern more than once, scouring the hay and beams for any sign of a stranger, but he found nothing. Tools disappeared and reappeared. Keys went missing. One of Victoria's newspapers turned up on the porch, though no one in the household had bought it. Then, one morning, Andreas noticed that the barn's lock had been broken. Something, or someone, was moving freely across their farm. The unease grew into fear. Victoria confessed to her friends at church that she felt unsafe, that something was wrong at Hinterkaifeck. The maid, who had worked for the family for years, left abruptly, insisting the farm was haunted, that she could no longer endure the atmosphere. She described disembodied footsteps, voices at night, the sensation of being watched. When she departed, the Grubers hired a new maid, a young woman named Maria Baumgartner. She would arrive on March 31st. She would live only a single night beneath that roof. But before Maria stepped foot on the farm, the shadows deepened. That final week of March was marked by a chill that refused to leave, though spring was supposed to be near. The wind hissed through the trees, and every creak of the house seemed amplified in the family's ears. Victoria's 7-year-old daughter began to speak of nightmares, of a face she claimed she saw peering through her window at night. Her small body trembled as she described eyes that never blinked, staring at her through the glass. Andreas dismissed it as childish fear, But even he could not hide his unease. And then the day came when all those premonitions converged. March 31st, 1922, a Friday. It began as any other. The rhythmic grind of farm life, the clatter of tools, the distant bark of a dog tethered by the barn. That morning, Victoria had gone to church, and neighbors had seen her looking pale, troubled, but forcing a polite smile. Later that day, Maria Baumgartner arrived to take up her duties as the new maid. She unpacked her modest belongings, unaware that she was stepping into a nightmare already set in motion. By evening, a sinister force would erupt. Yet the world outside Hinterkaifeck went on in its routine. Villagers stoked their hearths, bells rang in the church tower, and no one knew that within the walls of the farmstead, something monstrous was about to occur. When the murders came, they came with brutality beyond comprehension. Each member of the household, Andreas, his wife, his daughter Victoria, young Kazilia, toddler Josef, and the maid Maria, would be slaughtered one by one with blows from a mattock, a heavy farming tool. But it was not only the violence itself that horrified investigators. It was the aftermath. Whoever committed this atrocity did not simply kill and flee. They stayed. For days after the murders, smoke was seen rising from the farmhouse chimney. The cattle were fed. Meals were prepared. Bread was baked. It was as though the killer had slipped into the life of the family he had annihilated, moving about the house, sleeping in their beds, blending with their existence like a parasite. The thought alone was enough to curdle the blood of those who dared to imagine it, but that discovery was still to come. For now, on March 31st, the sun sank behind the forest, the last orange light fading over Hinterkaifeck's roof. Inside, the family prepared for nightfall, unaware that death had already entered. Imagine the silence of that evening, the dog whining softly in the barn, the shuffle of hay as cattle shifted, the wooden beams creaking as wind rattled the shutters. Then, perhaps, a sound, a step on the threshold, a faint creak of the barn door opening. Did Andreas hear it first? Did the patriarch, hardened and wary, step outside with a lantern in hand, peering into the shadows? Perhaps he thought it was just another trespasser, another thief wandering in the night. But what awaited him in that barn was no thief. It was the end of everything. We may never know in what order the murders took place. Some say Andreas was the first to fall, ambushed beneath the loft of hay. Others believe Victoria heard a commotion and rushed to his aid, only to be struck down. One by one, each family member was drawn into the barn, as if lured into a trap, and each was killed with merciless precision. Their bodies were left in a heap, straw thrown over them as a crude covering. The 7-year-old Kazilia, it is said, lived for hours after the blows, pulling at her hair in agony until death claimed her. The image alone chills the soul. Inside the farmhouse, the killer moved next. The maid Maria, barely settled into her new room, was struck down in her bed. Finally, little Joseph, asleep in his crib, was silenced forever. The entire household, 6 lives, extinguished in a single night of horror, and then silence. Not the silence of an empty house, but of one occupied by something unspeakable, for whoever killed them stayed. The next morning, smoke rose from the chimney as usual. To the outside world, Hinterkaifeck seemed untouched. Days passed. A postman delivered mail and saw no sign of alarm. Neighbors noticed the farm was quiet, but cattle were fed, and the dog barked as always. Victoria's absence from church on Sunday raised questions, but no immediate alarm. It was not until several days later, when concerned neighbors entered the farm, that the full scale of the atrocity was uncovered. The scene they found was one of the most haunting in criminal history. The barn, heavy with the smell of blood and hay, concealed the stacked bodies of Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and young Kazilia. In the farmhouse, the maid lay dead in her bed, and Yosef's tiny body rested in his cradle, forever stilled. The horror was not only in their deaths, but in the realization that the killer had lived among them afterward, calm enough to tend animals, to bake bread, to inhabit the house of the dead. When investigators arrived, they were shaken. Hardened men who had seen the devastation of the Great War turned pale, whispered prayers, crossed themselves as they stepped through the blood-stained rooms. The crime was savage, but it was also intimate, carried out with the farm's own tools, in the family's own barn, against victims who seemed to have been led, one after another, into their fate. And the questions began immediately. Who could commit such an act? What kind of mind could destroy a family and then calmly linger among their corpses? And why Hinterkaifeck? Why this isolated farm in the Bavarian woods? The villagers gathered at the scene in hushed disbelief. Some muttered of madness, others of vengeance, and still others of curses, of dark forces summoned by the family's sins. Theories swirled like the wind through the pines, but answers were few. Thus began the legend of Hinterkaifeck, a case where every clue only deepened the enigma, where every lead ended in shadows, a murder so brutal, so inexplicable, that it etched itself into the soul of a nation still reeling from war and loss. And it all began with footprints in the snow. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves across Bavaria. Word spread fast, from the neighboring hamlet to the nearest towns, then across the country. A farmstead wiped out, a family slaughtered, and the killer still at large. For villagers already haunted by whispers of strange happenings at Hinterkaifeck, the revelation was a nightmare made flesh. It was as though all the eerie signs, the footprints, the missing keys, the voices in the attic, had been building toward this final horror. The authorities arrived with grim efficiency. Police officers trudged up the lonely farm track, their boots sinking into mud, their hands clenching lanterns and notebooks. They were met with the stench of death, thick, metallic, almost sweet, carried on the cold air from the barn. When they pushed open the heavy doors, what they saw stopped them in their tracks. Beneath the straw, 4 bodies lay tangled together, faces unrecognizable, blood soaking the ground beneath. Andreas Gruber's features had been obliterated by repeated blows. His wife's skull was crushed. Victoria's face was caved in, her eyes swollen shut. Little Cecilia's wounds were so violent that hardened officers turned away. And yet, there were strands of her hair clutched in her small hands, as if she had torn it herself in her final moments, trying to escape pain too great to endure. Inside the house, the nightmare continued. In a modest chamber, Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, lay sprawled on her bed, struck down before she could truly begin her life in Hinterkaifeck. In the nursery, Josef, just 2 years old, had been killed in his cradle, a heavy blow ending his short existence before he could cry out. 6 lives ended with brutal precision, and yet the house told another story. Beds were neatly made, bread freshly cut, a lamp still burning with oil. Whoever had done this had lived here, calmly, after bathing the farm in blood. Investigators tried to steady themselves, but unease gnawed at every man who stepped across the threshold. The house did not feel abandoned. It felt occupied. Boots had moved across these floors since the murders. Doors had been opened and closed. Animals were fed. Even meals had been cooked. A killer who could live among the dead, surrounded by the silence of his own crime, seemed less like a man and more like a phantom. Something both real and unreal, rational and monstrous. The police began their search with desperation. They scoured the barn, the attic, the cellar, looking for fingerprints, footprints, any trace of the intruder. But the farmstead was a trap of contradictions. The footprints that Andreas had once seen leading into the farm, and not away. they were still unexplained. The attic, where the family had heard footsteps, yielded nothing but hay, dust, and shadows. The dog barked restlessly, tied to its chain, as though it still sensed a presence lingering on the farm. The investigators, though hardened by war and accustomed to death, began to glance over their shoulders, their nerves fraying with every hour spent in Hinterkaifeck. News spread, and soon crowds began to gather. Curious neighbors, grieving villagers, even ghoulish sightseers made the trek through the woods to peer at the infamous farm. They whispered rumors. Some swore they saw strange lights at night. Others claimed they heard voices drifting from the barn even after the bodies had been taken away. Fear mingled with fascination, and the legend of Hinterkaifeck began to grow, even before the blood on the walls had dried. The police, meanwhile, turned their attention to suspects. In crimes so intimate, so savage, the killer is often someone close to the victims. The Grubers were not loved in their community. Andreas Gruber was known as a tyrant, harsh, suspicious, even cruel. There were long-standing whispers of incest between Andreas and his daughter Victoria, rumors that she had given birth to Josef not through marriage but through violation. If this were true, it painted a portrait of a household steeped in darkness long before the murders. Perhaps the crime was born not of random violence, but of festering hatred. Investigators interrogated neighbors, farmhands, relatives. They traced every person who had quarreled with Andreas, every man who might have had ties to Victoria, every drifter who had passed through the village. The sheer brutality of the murders suggested rage, but the calmness of the aftermath, tending cattle, cooking meals, suggested calculation. This duality puzzled the police. Was the killer a madman or someone frighteningly composed? Among the villagers, fear gave way to suspicion. People eyed each other in church pews, muttered in corners, speculated about who among them might harbor such violence. The idea that a stranger could have wandered into their woods, murdered 6 people, and then lived undetected in the farm for days seemed almost impossible. But if it was not a stranger, then it was someone they knew, someone who walked their streets, who nodded politely, who might even sit at their table. The paranoia was suffocating, and then came the rumors of supernatural forces. Old women spoke of curses, of Hinterkaifeck's soil being poisoned by sin. The strange happenings before the murders, the footprints, the voices, the missing keys, were retold with chilling exaggeration. Some swore the farm was haunted, that the Grubers had been marked by fate long before the murders. In the absence of answers, superstition filled the void. The investigators worked tirelessly, but every lead twisted into nothing. They examined weapons, interviewed witnesses, even exhumed bodies in search of overlooked evidence. They sent the skulls of the victims to Munich, hoping modern science might find clues. The skulls never returned. The mutilated remains of the family were buried without them, a grim symbol of how unfinished the case already felt. As the days turned into weeks, theories multiplied. Perhaps it was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had once been romantically involved with Victoria and might have fathered Joseph. Perhaps it was a vagrant, wandering through Bavaria, who stumbled upon the farm and unleashed his madness. Perhaps it was revenge from old grudges. Each theory carried weight, yet none could be proven. The evidence was slippery, fading with time, and the killer's identity dissolved into fog. But beyond the mechanics of the investigation, there was something deeper, more disturbing, that gripped the nation. The image of a killer living on the farm, feeding animals, cooking meals, existing in the house of the dead, struck a chord of primal terror. It was as though evil itself had moved into Hinterkaifeck, wearing human skin, mocking the boundary between life and death. This detail turned the murders from tragedy into legend, a story too haunting to ever let go. and in the village, the farm became a scar. Children dared each other to walk near it. Adults avoided the path altogether. The woods around Hinterkaifeck seemed darker, the air heavier, the silence unbearable. Even as the farm was eventually abandoned, its reputation grew, whispered across Germany as a place where evil had walked freely. For the families of the dead, there was no closure. Grief was compounded by shame, by whispers of incest, by the lack of justice. Victoria's church choir sang for her, but even in mourning, there was tension. Had she been victim or participant in her father's darkness? Was Joseph a child of love or of sin? These questions poisoned remembrance, leaving the victims half sympathetic, half condemned in the eyes of neighbors. Still, the brutality of their deaths silenced judgment. Whatever their secrets, no one deserved such an end. 6 lives snuffed out, with no explanation, no arrest, no justice. And so the story of Hinterkaifeck began to slip into something larger than a crime. It became a parable, a dark tale whispered at night, a reminder of how fragile safety truly is. Imagine standing in that barn, the wind whistling through cracks in the wood, the straw still damp with blood. Imagine hearing the creak of the loft above, wondering if the killer still lingers. Imagine the oppressive silence, broken only by the restless dog chained nearby. That silence, heavier than any scream, has echoed through history, keeping the case alive in memory long after all who lived it have turned to dust. And yet, the deeper one looks into the story, the more it resists explanation. The footprints that never left, the missing keys, the voices in the attic, were they warnings or tricks of the mind? Did the Grubers know their fate was coming, and did they choose to ignore it out of stubbornness or fear or resignation? These unanswered questions have become part of the legend, making Hinterkaifeck not just a crime scene, but a riddle carved into the annals of true crime. The case file grew thick with interviews, rumors, half-clues. Decades would pass, investigators would revisit the evidence, modern criminologists would apply new techniques, but the core mystery remained untouched. The killer had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only horror and speculation. And in the end, the most terrifying truth may be this: the killer was not caught because he was never meant to be. Hinterkaifeck was less a crime to be solved than a curse to be endured, a reminder that in the heart of the familiar, the monstrous can dwell unseen. The farm would eventually be demolished, but even in rubble, its story clung to the land like a stain. Farmers avoided plowing near its former foundations. Travelers hurried past the woods at dusk, and those who dared to speak of it lowered their voices, as though afraid the story itself could summon something back. Thus the murders of Hinterkaifeck slipped into eternity, their details still vivid, their mystery still unsolved, their atmosphere still heavy enough to chill the blood of anyone who dares to remember. The deeper investigators dug, the more the case seemed to coil back upon itself, like a snake swallowing its own tail. Each clue, each witness statement, only fed more uncertainty, and the center of the mystery grew darker with every turn. What had happened at Hinterkaifeck was not just a massacre. It was an intimate act, precise, deliberate, and driven by forces still concealed in shadow. Among the first names whispered with unease was that of Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor whose presence in the story was unavoidable. He had known the Gruber family for years. He had walked their fields, shared conversations with Victoria, and once been close enough to her that villagers believed he was the father of young Joseph. This connection made him both sympathetic and suspect, a man entangled in the tragedy more tightly than most dared to admit. Lorenz was among those who discovered the bodies. Alongside 2 companions, he made his way into the barn, his boots crunching straw, his lantern cutting into the gloom. When the men uncovered the mound of corpses, the others recoiled, gasping, crossing themselves, muttering half-formed prayers. But Lorenz behaved differently. He pushed deeper into the barn, lifted straw with his bare hands, turned bodies over, examined wounds with a composure that chilled the others. Some swore he seemed almost too comfortable, as though he already knew what he would find. Later, in the house, his behavior was equally unsettling. He entered the farmhouse boldly, as though he had the right to be there. He fed the cattle. He released the dog from its chain. He even prepared food in the kitchen. To some, it seemed an act of practicality, tending to chores that needed to be done. But to others, it was eerie, intrusive, almost possessive. Why would a man, moments after discovering such horror, move so calmly through the house of the dead? Why would he act as though it were his own? Suspicion sharpened when whispers of his past with Victoria resurfaced. Before Joseph was born, Victoria had confided to neighbors that Lorenz intended to marry her. He had even reportedly agreed to recognize Joseph as his son, despite the rumors of incest that swirled around the family. But the marriage never took place. Something soured between them. Some said Andreas Gruber forbade it. Others claimed Lorenz himself recoiled from the scandal of being tied to the Grubers. Whatever the truth, bitterness lingered, and in that bitterness lay motive. Investigators questioned him closely. Why had he been so composed at the crime scene? Why had he entered the house as if it belonged to him? Why, when asked about Joseph, did his answers shift, hesitant and contradictory? Lorenz denied everything. He insisted he had nothing to do with the killings. Yet doubt clung to him like smoke. In the village, gossip swelled. Lorenz had the strength, the knowledge of the farm, the intimate connection to the victims. He could have killed them, they whispered, and perhaps his strange calmness was not composure, but guilt bleeding through. But if Lorenz was the killer, why remain on the farm afterward? Why linger in the house, feed the cattle, light fires, live among the corpses? Was it guilt, madness, or something even more unexplainable? The contradictions were maddening, and then there were the other suspects. One by one, investigators peeled back layers of the village's private life, exposing grudges, jealousies, old feuds. The Grubers were not loved. They were tolerated, feared, sometimes despised. Andreas's tyranny had left scars. Victoria's complicated relationships had bred envy and scandal. Nearly every neighbor had reason to resent them, and in a small village, resentment can fester until it erupts. There was the theory of a traveling vagrant, a drifter who stumbled upon the farm and committed the murders in a frenzy. It was plausible, but it didn't explain the calm aftermath. The feeding of animals, the stoking of fires. A stranger would have fled into the woods, not settled into the home of the dead. There was talk of robbery, but valuables remained untouched. Gold coins, jewelry, even banknotes lay where they always had. Whoever killed the Grubers had not come for money. The crime was not theft, but annihilation. And so suspicion kept circling back to those who knew the family best. Lorenz Schlittenbauer's name appeared again and again in police reports. He admitted to being close to Victoria, admitted that Joseph could have been his child, admitted to quarreling with Andreas. Yet there was no proof, no weapon found in his possession, no blood on his hands, no witness who could place him at the farm on that fatal night. He slipped through the cracks of evidence, neither cleared nor condemned. The investigators pressed further. They called upon villagers, examined alibis, sent letters to other towns, but each theory tangled into contradiction. Some witnesses swore they saw strangers lurking in the woods near Hinterkaifeck. Others spoke of lantern lights flickering on the farm in the days after the murders, as if the killer were signaling someone in the forest. Still others reported hearing voices in the distance, laughter carried on the wind, though no one could be found when they searched. The case was transforming. It was no longer just a crime to be solved. It was becoming folklore, a chilling tale retold around hearths, embroidered with fear and imagination. The name, Hinterkaifeck, itself began to feel less like a place and more like a curse, a word that carried dread whenever it was spoken. And still, the haunting details returned. The footprints in the snow, the missing keys, the sounds in the attic. Who had been living in the farmhouse before the murders? Had the killer already moved in, silently coexisting with the family, watching them day after day, waiting for the moment to strike? The thought was unbearable. The idea that someone could watch you sleep, hear your conversations, breathe in the same air, all while plotting your destruction. The villagers grew restless. Many locked their doors for the first time in their lives. Farmers carried weapons into the fields. Mothers forbade children from wandering the forest paths. And yet, fear was not enough to erase curiosity. People continued to visit the ruins of the farm, peering at the barn where the murders had taken place, shivering at the silence that seemed to throb with memory. They whispered of seeing figures among the trees, of hearing footsteps behind them, of feeling watched. Hinterkaifeck had become more than a crime scene. It was an open wound in the land itself. As weeks turned into months, the investigation faltered. No arrest came, no confession. The authorities, pressured by the public, released vague statements promising justice, but privately, they admitted they were lost. The case was too strange, too layered with contradictions. The killer had vanished into air, and yet suspicion lingered like smoke in a closed room. Every villager eyed his neighbor with doubt. Every stranger was scrutinized, and always in the center of their suspicion was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, walking the streets, attending church, tending his own farm, all while whispers followed him like shadows. Some believed he was guilty. Others believed he had been cursed by proximity, forever tied to a crime he had not committed. Either way, his life would never escape the taint of Hinterkaifeck. The Gruber's graves became a place of uneasy pilgrimage. Villagers brought flowers but left quickly, as though afraid to linger too long. The absence of the victims' skulls, sent to Munich and never returned, made the burials feel incomplete, a macabre detail that deepened the sense of desecration. Even in death, the family was not whole. The farm itself stood silent. Animals were sold, belongings dispersed, but the land remained heavy with dread. The house creaked in the wind, windows staring blankly into the forest. Some claimed lights still flickered in the attic at night, long after the place was abandoned. Others said the dog still barked at shadows, tied to nothing but memory. And so the case of Hinterkaifeck entered a strange twilight. Not resolved, not forgotten, but suspended in mystery. The killer had written his message not with words, but with blood, and the message was simple. You are never safe, not even in your own home. It is a truth that chills more than any ghost story. For the Grubers were not killed in the wilderness, nor in war, nor by strangers on a distant road. They were killed in the very heart of their own farm, surrounded by the familiar, under the same roof where they had lived for years. The walls that should have sheltered them became their tomb. The barn that should have been their livelihood became their grave. The killer did not break into their lives. He dissolved into them, as if he had always been there. And that is what makes Hinterkaifeck endure. Not just the brutality of the murders, but the intimacy of them. It was a crime that stripped away the illusion of safety, that revealed how thin the walls are between the ordinary and the monstrous. It was not simply a story of death, but a revelation of how fragile human existence truly is. And in the silence that followed, Germany, already battered by war, hunger, and political unrest, found itself staring into a mirror it did not want to face. Hinterkaifeck was not just a tragedy of one family. It was a symbol, a haunting reminder that evil does not always come from afar. Sometimes it walks on familiar paths, leaves footprints in the snow, and waits quietly in the attic. The days after the massacre blurred into one another like a fever dream. The police files swelled with testimonies, names, and contradictions, yet every page seemed to lead only deeper into confusion. The more investigators tried to impose order, the more the case unraveled, as if the murders themselves refused to be contained by logic. By the summer of 1922, the official inquiry had already become entangled in a web of rumor and fear. In Munich, detectives reviewed reports, sketched timelines, and debated motives. In the village, neighbors whispered that justice would never come, not because the police were incompetent, but because the crime itself belonged to a darkness no man could master. Hinterkaifeck was not just a murder site. It was a place where the natural order had cracked and something had slipped through. Yet the investigators pressed forward. They drew up lists of potential suspects. There were farmhands who had quarreled with Andreas. There were vagrants spotted near the woods. There were men who had admired Victoria, men who might have been consumed by lust, jealousy, or vengeance. Dozens of names were collected, interrogated, dismissed. Each time a suspect was eliminated, the silence of the case deepened, as though mocking the very attempt at resolution. One of the more chilling details emerged during these interrogations: the possibility that the killer had hidden in the house before the murders. The family had complained of noises in the attic. Their former maid had quit, insisting the farm was haunted. Objects had gone missing. Newspapers had appeared without explanation. What if the murderer had been there all along, crouched in the rafters, moving at night, breathing quietly as the family slept below? What if for weeks, or even months, they had not been alone in their home? This thought struck investigators with dread, but it also explained too much to ignore. How else could someone have learned the rhythms of the household? How else could they have lured each victim one by one into the barn without panic spreading through the house? Only someone who knew them, or someone who had studied them in silence, could have achieved such control. It was a theory too terrifying to dismiss. The villagers, meanwhile, turned their suspicion into a ritual. Every Sunday after church, conversations circled back to Hinterkaifeck. Women carried baskets of bread and lowered their voices. Men leaned on canes and muttered theories. Children listened wide-eyed, feeding their nightmares. The farm had become a story they could not stop telling, even as it unsettled them. Each retelling grew darker, embroidered with fresh details, as if the murders themselves were still unfolding in their imaginations. But while the villagers traded tales, the authorities faced humiliation. No arrests had been made. The newspapers published lurid articles, stoking public outrage. Headlines screamed of incompetence, of demons walking in Bavaria, of a country unable to protect its own. The Hinterkaifeck case was no longer a local tragedy. It was a national scandal, a black mark on a justice system already strained by post-war chaos. And then, suspicion returned with renewed intensity to the figure of Lawrence Schlittenbauer. His proximity to the family, his claim to Joseph's paternity, his strange behavior at the scene, all of it fit too neatly into the narrative of guilt. But there were holes. Lawrence had alibis, neighbors who vouched for him. His own grief seemed genuine to some, staged to others. He lived under the shadow of suspicion for years, never charged, never cleared, condemned not by law, but by whispers that followed him until his death. Others pointed fingers at traveling workers, the so-called tramps who moved from farm to farm. The countryside after the Great War was filled with such men, veterans, wanderers, men broken by loss and hunger. Could one of them have stumbled upon Hinterkaifeck and turned savage? But again, the detail of the farm being maintained afterward made this unlikely. Such men sought escape, not routine. And then came stranger theories. Some suggested that multiple killers had been involved, perhaps even a group, who had planned the murders together and shared the responsibility of hiding afterward. The precision of the crime, the luring of victims one by one, the maintenance of the farm, These details could point to organization, not solitude. Others argued it was impossible. The more people involved, the greater the chance of betrayal, confession, exposure. And yet the silence was total. Amid this confusion, the land itself grew heavier. The farm stood still, empty, its walls absorbing the weight of death. When the wind swept through the trees at night, villagers swore they heard cries, muffled sobs, the echo of blows. Rational minds dismissed it as imagination, but fear clings stronger than reason. Hinterkaifeck became a place to avoid. Even in daylight, the path to the farm seemed darker than the rest of the forest, as though shadows lingered there longer than elsewhere. Time passed, but the horror did not fade. Instead, it transformed into something larger, a legend that carried its own gravity. Journalists returned again and again, scribbling fresh stories, each version darker than the last. Travelers came to stare at the farmhouse, to peer through windows, to shiver at the thought of standing where 6 souls had been destroyed. And yet, the more attention the case drew, the further justice seemed to slip away. Every rumor became a distraction, every suspicion a dead end. The files thickened, but the truth remained buried. The most haunting image, repeated in every account, was not just the brutality of the killings, but the unnatural calm that followed. The bread baked, the cattle fed, the fires lit. Each detail struck the public like a blade, more terrible than the blows of the mattock. It suggested a killer not only ruthless, but methodical, capable of merging seamlessly into the lives he had destroyed. That image has lived longer than any theory, because it is more than a fact. It is a nightmare. By the year's end, the farm was a husk. The animals were gone. The rooms lay bare, stripped of life, but not of presence. Doors creaked without wind. The barn smelled forever of blood. Children dared each other to creep inside, then fled shrieking at the silence. Adults avoided it altogether. It became, even while still standing, a ruin of the soul. And then, in a decision both practical and symbolic, the farm was demolished. Boards were pulled down, beams toppled, the earth cleared. But demolition did not erase its memory. On the contrary, the destruction of the farmhouse made it more myth than reality. Hinterkaifeck no longer existed as a place. It existed as a story, untethered to walls, capable of haunting minds anywhere. At the demolition, villagers gathered in silence, watching as the house that had guarded its secrets collapsed. Some said they felt relief. Others said they felt only deeper unease, as though tearing down the walls freed something best left contained. The land remained, barren, unplowed. Farmers avoided sowing crops on it. The soil seemed tainted, the ground heavy with what it had absorbed. But the story did not end with rubble. It grew. In taverns, in newspapers, in hushed conversations across Germany, the name Hinterkaifeck spread like smoke. It became a warning, a symbol, a question without answer. And the questions were endless. Who had fed the animals after the murders? Who had cut bread from the family's loaf? Who had lived, unseen, in the house of the dead? And why had he stopped? Why had he finally left, vanishing as silently as he had arrived? Was it guilt, fear, or satisfaction? Did he walk away into the forest and disappear forever? Or did he return to the village, nodding politely to his neighbors, carrying his secret like a stone in his chest? The silence of the case was its most terrifying feature. There were no confessions, no deathbed admissions, no whispered drunken boasts in taverns. Whoever killed the Grubers carried the secret to his grave, and perhaps that was the final cruelty, that the murderer walked away not only with 6 lives, but with the truth itself. Even the investigators admitted defeat. The files were boxed, shelved, reopened, reviewed, but never resolved. Each new officer who examined the case brought new theories, and each theory collapsed under scrutiny. Hinterkaifeck became a test of endurance for the imagination, a riddle that mocked every attempt at solution. And so the story of Hinterkaifeck passed into time, not as a solved crime, but as an open wound. Decades would pass. Germany itself would plunge into new darkness, political chaos, dictatorship, war. But the memory of Hinterkaifeck clung stubbornly to the nation's consciousness. Long after the barn collapsed, long after the last villager who remembered it firsthand was gone, the story remained. Because Hinterkaifeck was never just about 6 deaths. It was about the terror of intrusion, the horror of intimacy, the violation of the most sacred space, the home. It was about the silence that follows screams, the calm after carnage, the nightmare of someone stepping into your life, your bed, your kitchen, and continuing as if nothing had changed. It was about the footprint that enters and never leaves, and that silence, heavier than any scream, darker than any shadow, is why Hinterkaifeck endures. Years passed, yet the silence of Hinterkaifeck refused to fade. The rubble of the demolished farm settled into the soil, grass grew over its foundations, but the story was alive, carried in whispers, in newspapers, in the restless imagination of a nation. The official investigation might have stalled, but the murders refused to die. They clung to memory with claws sharper than any mattock. By the late 1920s, fresh eyes were brought to the case. New detectives, less haunted by the immediate horror, sifted through the files with clinical patience. They read the interviews, studied the crime scene sketches, examined photographs yellowing at the edges. What they found was not clarity, but chaos, contradictions, inconsistencies, testimonies twisted by fear and gossip. Yet from the mess, certain images stood out with terrifying sharpness. The barn, the heap of bodies, the cradle where Joseph had been struck down. These were not just facts. They were symbols, too powerful to ignore. Among the files was the name that never left, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Time had not erased suspicion. If anything, it had deepened it. His connection to Victoria, his claim of paternity, his strange composure at the scene. These details hardened into legend, retold by villagers until they became almost evidence themselves. Lorenz lived under a shadow that lengthened with each retelling, and though he denied the accusations until his death, his name remained tied forever to Hinterkaifeck. But the new investigators also explored broader theories. Could the murders have been the work of multiple perpetrators? The sequence of deaths suggested strategy, luring victims one by one into the barn without raising alarm. Was this too complex for a single man? Some argued yes. Others pointed out that fear itself could have paralyzed the family, each member drawn into the trap out of loyalty, not suspicion. Perhaps they had heard Andreas's cries, rushed to help, and met the same fate. Perhaps a single killer with patience and knowledge of the family's trust had been enough. Then there was the question of the killer's strange calmness afterward. Who could slaughter 6 people and then remain on the farm, feeding animals, cooking meals, sleeping in the victims' beds? To investigators, this detail was as chilling as the murders themselves. It suggested not only cruelty, but a mind capable of dissolving the line between life and death. Was it madness? Or was it a twisted kind of possession, a man stepping into the roles of those he had destroyed, wearing their lives like clothing stolen from corpses? In the years that followed, the case became a mirror for Germany itself. The country, reeling from war and humiliation, sinking into economic despair, found in Hinterkaifeck a story that reflected its own unease. Violence had invaded the home. Trust had been shattered. The familiar had become unsafe. The tale was told not only as true crime, but as metaphor, a dark parable whispered as the Weimar Republic teetered. And then came the 1930s, and with them, the rise of a new order. The Nazi regime, obsessed with control, inherited the unsolved case. Files were revisited. Police loyal to the Reich reviewed evidence, eager to prove efficiency where the Weimar authorities had failed. Yet even under the new state, the case resisted resolution. No confession was extracted, no suspect convicted. Hinterkaifeck remained untamed, an open wound even the iron grip of dictatorship could not close. Villagers who still remembered the night of the murders grew old. Some swore their suspicions had hardened into certainty. They pointed to faces in their memory, voices they recalled in whispers. Others admitted their doubt only deepened with time. It could have been anyone, they muttered. And that is the worst part. The killer had vanished so completely that the absence itself became proof of cunning beyond comprehension. The case was revived again after the Second World War, as if horror had summoned horror. Germany, broken once more, looked back into the shadows of its past. In the 1950s, investigators with modern forensic methods revisited Hinterkaifeck. They reviewed skulls preserved in Munich, studied wound patterns, compared theories with precision. But the skulls, already handled for decades, yielded no secrets. The wounds told only what was already known, that the victims had been struck with terrible force, over and over, until their features dissolved into ruin. One chilling fact emerged, however. The wounds were not all the same. Some blows were delivered with rage, others with cold precision. This suggested something disturbing. Either multiple killers, each with their own manner, or a single killer whose fury ebbed and flowed like a tide, alternating between madness and calculation. Neither explanation offered comfort. By now, the case had slipped fully into myth. It was taught in police academies, debated in criminology seminars, dissected in newspaper features. Each retelling emphasized different horrors. The footprints in the snow, the attic noises, the feeding of cattle. Some leaned into the human suspects. Lorenz, the vagrants, jealous lovers. Others surrendered to the uncanny, suggesting ghosts, curses, or madness, seeded in the soil itself. Hinterkaifeck had become less a crime to be solved than a story to be told, a canvas upon which each generation painted its own fears, and always beneath the theories pulsed the same chilling truth. The killer had escaped. He had walked away from 6 bodies and carried his silence into eternity. Perhaps he confessed to no one. Perhaps he laughed about it in secret. Perhaps he sat in church on Sundays, singing hymns beside neighbors who never guessed. That possibility, that the murderer was not a shadowy stranger but someone known, ordinary, integrated into the fabric of the village, was more terrifying than any ghost story. By the 1960s, Hinterkaifeck had become part of German folklore. Writers, journalists, amateur sleuths all returned to the case, each convinced they might untangle it. But the more they studied, the more they found themselves ensnared. Every clue contradicted another. Every suspect dissolved into uncertainty. The crime seemed designed not to be solved, but to be remembered. In the village itself, the land where the farm once stood was left untouched. Grass grew tall, children avoided it, farmers plowed around it. The absence of the farmhouse became its own presence. Travelers who visited swore they felt heaviness in the air, as though the earth itself still remembered. At night, the woods seemed darker there, the wind harsher, the silence unbearable. And yet, people kept coming. Decade after decade, strangers sought out Hinterkaifeck, drawn not by morbid curiosity alone, but by something deeper, a need to stand at the edge of the unknowable, to face the kind of mystery that mocks reason, to gaze into the void and feel it gaze back. What lingers about Hinterkaifeck is not only the brutality of the act, but the intimacy of it. These were not anonymous victims. They were a family, with names, faces, routines, sins, and hopes. They were people who rose each morning to feed animals, who sang in church, who quarreled and reconciled like anyone else. They lived ordinary lives, until the night the ordinary cracked open and something monstrous stepped through. That is why the story endures, because it is not about strangers in the night. It is about the collapse of safety, the intrusion of violence into the very heart of the familiar. It is about the terror of realizing that the walls of your home are paper thin, that footsteps in the attic may not be imagination, that the silence outside your window may conceal someone watching. It is about the human truth we avoid until forced to face it, that evil does not always come from afar. Sometimes it waits patiently in the rafters, listening, and in Hinterkaifeck it struck with a fury that still echoes a century later. The 20th century marched forward, but Hinterkaifeck did not vanish with it. The farm had been demolished, its stones scattered, its timbers sold, yet the memory clung to Germany like smoke that never clears. Every decade someone returned to the case, lifting its heavy lid, peering into its depths, only to find themselves staring into the same abyss of uncertainty. By the 1970s, a new generation of investigators and criminologists had turned their attention to Hinterkaifeck. Advances in forensic science promised answers that had eluded their predecessors. Fingerprinting, blood analysis, psychological profiling, tools unimagined in 1922 were now in the hands of experts. They reopened the files, unrolled brittle photographs, traced the testimony of villagers long since dead. And yet, the promise of science collided with the stubborn silence of the past. The evidence was too degraded, the chain of custody too fractured, the bones themselves incomplete. The skulls of the victims, once sent to Munich, had disappeared during the chaos of the Second World War. Without them, vital details were lost forever. Still, investigators pressed on. They analyzed the crime scene sketches, the positions of the bodies, the patterns of the blows. What emerged was not clarity, but a portrait of savagery. The killer had wielded the mattock with relentless precision. He struck Andreas with such force that bones splintered like dry wood. He caved in Victoria's face, silencing her forever. He crushed Kazilia's small skull, then left her to linger in agony. And then he moved through the house as though the massacre were merely a prelude to routine, feeding animals, lighting fires, baking bread. The contrast between brutality and calm haunted modern profilers. It spoke of a mind not only capable of violence, but of compartmentalization, someone who could kill without hesitation, then step into domestic rituals as if nothing had changed. Psychologists studied the case as if it were an X-ray of evil. They debated whether the killer was driven by rage, sexual desire, or pure domination. The incest rumors between Andreas and Victoria darkened their conclusions. If Josef was the product of such sin, then the murders could have been an act of vengeance, an outsider punishing the family, or an insider seeking to erase shame. Some argued the killer may have been a spurned lover of Victoria, unable to bear rejection. Others suggested a neighbor, humiliated by Andreas, finally unleashing long-held fury. Each theory carried weight. None carried proof. As modern criminology advanced, the case grew not smaller, but larger. It became a subject of fascination for students, journalists, and amateur sleuths. Books were written, documentaries produced, podcasts recorded. Each medium retold the story with its own emphasis. The eerie footprints in the snow, the footsteps in the attic, the helpless cries of young Kazilia. These details repeated like refrains in a song, etching themselves into the cultural memory. And then, in the early 2000s, a bold attempt was made. German police reopened the case unofficially, applying computer analysis, database cross-checks, and psychological profiling with 21st century methods. They revisited every known suspect, reconstructing their lives, tracing descendants, piecing together alibis. For months, the cold case unit worked, building a portrait of Hinterkaifeck with modern eyes. At the end of their study, they reached a chilling conclusion. They believed they had identified the killer, yet they would not name him publicly. Out of respect for surviving relatives, they withheld the name, stating only that the case was now considered closed in principle. To the public, this was maddening. To hint at truth, then hide it, was to reopen the wound. Speculation erupted. Was it Lorenz Schlittenbauer, forever the prime suspect in the eyes of villagers? Was it another neighbor, forgotten by history but unmasked by modern profiling? Or was it someone entirely unexpected? The silence of the police was more haunting than an answer. It kept Hinterkaifeck alive, and so the case endured, not as a file in an archive, but as a ghost in the public imagination. People still visit the site where the farm once stood. A memorial stone marks the place, weathered and solemn, engraved with the names of the 6 victims. Pilgrims of true crime kneel before it, placing flowers, tracing names with trembling fingers. They come not only for curiosity, but for something deeper, to stand in the shadow of a mystery that refuses to die, to feel the echo of fear that once clung to these fields, to confront the darkness that waits in the ordinary. For Hinterkaifeck is not simply about who swung the mattock. It is about the collapse of safety. It is about a family who heard footsteps in their attic, who saw footprints in the snow, who felt eyes upon them, and chose to endure it, perhaps because they had no choice, perhaps because they could not imagine the horror waiting in the shadows. It is about the thin wall between suspicion and catastrophe, the fragile thread of trust that binds a household until it snaps. The tragedy also speaks to a universal terror, the violation of the home. We build our houses as fortresses, imagining their walls will protect us from the chaos of the world outside. But Hinterkaifeck reveals the truth we try to bury. That danger does not always knock at the door. Sometimes it waits inside. Sometimes it climbs into the rafters, listens to your prayers, watches you sleep, and waits for the moment to strike. And then there is the most chilling image of all, the killer remaining afterward. The thought of him moving through rooms still warm with blood, of him tending animals while corpses lay in straw, of him slicing bread from the family's loaf as though continuing their lives, is almost too much to bear. It is a grotesque parody of domesticity, a murderer performing the routines of the dead, as if mocking the very idea of safety. That detail, more than any other, has made Hinterkaifeck immortal in crime history, because it embodies something worse than death. It embodies intrusion, possession, the theft not only of life, but of identity itself. To this day, historians, criminologists, and storytellers return to Hinterkaifeck, each hoping to pierce its silence, and each time, the silence answers back with the same unyielding truth. We do not know. Perhaps we never will. Perhaps the killer intended it that way. Perhaps the greatest cruelty of all was not the killing itself, but the erasure of answers, leaving behind only questions to echo forever. And so the fields of Bavaria remain quiet, grass swaying where the farmhouse once stood, birds circling in skies that remember nothing, and yet everything. Visitors who linger there speak of unease, of the strange stillness, of the sense that the earth itself carries memory. The memorial stone stands as both marker and warning, a reminder that some mysteries do not fade with time. They root themselves into the land, into the air, into the imagination, and they remain. The murders of Hinterkaifeck endure because they are not just history. They are a mirror, a reflection of our deepest fears, a reminder that the most terrifying footsteps are not the ones that approach, but the ones that never leave. 100 years have passed since that spring night when the shadows of Hinterkaifeck swallowed 6 lives, and yet the story refuses to rest. Time has buried wars, toppled empires, rewritten nations, but it has not silenced the whispers rising from those Bavarian fields. If anything, the distance of years has sharpened the edge of the mystery. The further it recedes into history, the more it grips the imagination, like a wound that never heals, but instead grows deeper with retelling. In the early hours of April 1922, the world at large had not noticed the little farm hidden behind the woods. It was ordinary, unremarkable, one of countless homesteads scattered across rural Germany. But by the time neighbors pulled back the straw in the barn and uncovered the heap of bodies beneath, Hinterkaifeck was transformed. It became something more than a place. It became a name that carried dread, an idea that traveled like a rumor too heavy to contain. The image of that farm has lived longer than its timbers. Imagine it again. The lonely track winding through the forest, the house crouched beneath wide skies, the barn standing like a sentinel against the wind, the windows staring blankly, the dog barking in the yard, the fields silent and watchful. This was not a battlefield. It was a home. And that is why the murders burn so brightly in memory, because they strip the word home of its meaning. The investigators are long dead. The villagers who whispered and pointed fingers have been carried into the soil. Even the descendants who once flinched at the mention of Hinterkaifeck are fading into the past. And still, the story pulses with life. Every generation reopens the file, not because they expect to solve it, but because they cannot bear to let it go. The unanswered questions gnaw at us. Who walked across that snow, leaving footprints that never returned? Who crept through the attic at night, listening to the breathing of the family below? Who swung the mattock again and again until faces were gone and silence was absolute? And perhaps most chilling, who stayed? Who lingered for days among the dead, feeding animals, cooking meals, living a parody of the lives he had erased? That detail alone transforms the crime into myth. For the idea of a murderer is horrifying, but the idea of a murderer who slips so easily into the ordinary, who inhabits the routines of the slain, is unbearable. It suggests that evil is not always chaos. Sometimes it is order in disguise. Modern minds search for patterns. Criminologists speak of profiles: a neighbor, a spurned lover, a man broken by war, a secret relative. Psychologists analyze the act of overkill, the calm after violence, the possibility of psychosis. Historians weigh the shame of incest rumors, the bitterness of village grudges, the rage of poverty and humiliation. And yet, the more explanations they offer, the more the mystery resists. Hinterkaifeck is not a puzzle to be solved, but a shadow to be faced. Each theory may feel plausible, but none can penetrate the silence of that barn. And so the story has transformed into something else, not only a crime story, but a mirror. It forces us to confront our deepest fears, that we are never truly safe, that the walls of our homes are thinner than we think, that the people we trust may hide unfathomable darkness. It whispers the truth that no one wants to hear, that the greatest danger does not come from strangers in distant places, but from footsteps in the snow outside your door, from a face in the window at night, from the silence above your ceiling where no one should be. The land itself seems to remember. Visitors to the site of the old farm describe a heaviness in the air, a silence too dense, as if the earth itself absorbed the cries of that night and refuses to release them. A stone now marks the spot, engraved with 6 names, weathered by rain and wind. Flowers are left there by strangers who never knew the family, yet feel the weight of their story. True crime pilgrims kneel before it not in curiosity alone, but in reverence, as though they are standing at the edge of something sacred and cursed. And when night falls, the imagination takes over. You can almost hear it. The faint creak of wood in the barn, the shuffle of straw, the restless bark of a dog straining against its chain. You can almost see it, a flicker of lantern light in the attic, a shadow moving across a window pane, a figure walking slowly through the yard with no face visible. The air itself seems to whisper, as though the fields are trying to tell the story but cannot find the words. Perhaps that is why the case endures, because it refuses to give us closure. It denies us the comfort of justice, the relief of truth. Instead, it leaves us with questions sharp as glass, and the silence that follows them. In that silence, we hear our own fears, our own doubts, our own awareness that safety is fragile,